I still remember the sound before I saw anything, that sharp mechanical chewing noise slicing through the quiet morning like something being slowly torn apart. And for a few seconds my half-asleep brain tried to convince me it was a bad dream, but then I smelled it. That raw green smell of freshly cut leaves mixed with gasoline, and my chest tightened before my eyes even reached the window because deep down I already knew. And when I pulled the curtain back, my stomach dropped so hard it felt like I'd missed a step on a staircase, because my hedges, the thick, tall hedges I'd spent years growing and trimming and protecting like a living wall, were being butchered right in front of my house by two men in bright vests with industrial trimmers, their blades flashing as chunks of green fell away. And behind them stood the HOA president, arms folded, sunglasses on, smiling like he was watching a job well done. And I swear something inside me cracked in that moment. Not snapped loudly, not exploded, but fractured quietly in a way that would never heal the same. Those hedges weren't just plants to me. They were privacy. They were peace. They were the reason I could sit on my porch at night without feeling like I was on display. The reason my living room didn't feel like a fishbowl for bored neighbors and passing cars. And I had planted them when I first moved in because the view behind my house was nothing but a stretch of road and the oversized house of the HOA president himself, sitting smugly on a slight rise, his windows staring straight down at my property like unblinking eyes. And when I'd asked years ago if the hedges were okay, I'd gotten a lazy email back saying they were acceptable. And I'd saved that email, because I save everything. And standing there watching those men cut my privacy down to knee height without a single knock on my door, without a single conversation, my hands started shaking, not with rage yet, but with disbelief. That cold, hollow feeling where your brain keeps asking, are they really doing this? Is this actually happening? And I ran outside barefoot, heart pounding, yelling for them to stop, my voice cracking in a way I hated because it gave away how much this mattered to me. And the workers froze, but the HOA president didn't even flinch. He just lifted his chin and said, calmly, almost kindly, "It's for a better view." Like that explained everything. Like that justified ripping away something I'd built with my own hands. And I demanded to know whose view, already knowing the answer, and he gestured behind him toward his house and said, "The neighborhood deserves openness." And that was when the disbelief turned into something darker, heavier, because openness for him meant exposure for me. It meant my backyard laid bare, my windows visible, my life suddenly public. And I told him he had no right, that he never notified me, that this was my property line. And he smiled wider and said, "The HOA has discretion." And I felt small for a split second, the way systems are designed to make you feel, like you're yelling into the wind, like the rules are written in invisible ink that only certain people can read. And when I threatened to replace the hedges, he shrugged and said, "Then we'll trim them again," and laughed. Actually laughed. And that laugh followed me back into the house after the cutting stopped, echoed in my head while I stared at what was left of my green wall, now ragged and uneven and pathetic. And I sat on my couch staring straight into his windows for the first time ever, realizing he could now do the same to me. And the anger finally arrived, slow and deliberate, not explosive but focused, the kind that doesn't scream but plans. For the rest of that day, I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't send emails or make calls. I just watched. I watched how the sunlight now poured into my yard differently, how cars slowed slightly because they could see straight through, how exposed I felt sitting in my own home. And every time I caught a glimpse of that house on the rise, I imagined his smile, imagined him standing there later, coffee in hand, enjoying his better view. And by nightfall, I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry in the traditional sense. I was resolved, because something fundamental had shifted, and I understood that this wasn't about hedges at all. It was about control, and control, once challenged, doesn't respond to politeness. I went to my computer and pulled up the HOA bylaws, not because I planned to fight them through emails or meetings or complaints, but because I wanted to know exactly how far the lines went, where the gray areas lived, what spaces existed between their rules. And as I read, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes when you stop asking for fairness and start preparing for outcomes.
And I learned something important that night, something the HOA president had clearly forgotten in his confidence, which was that while hedges were regulated for aesthetic consistency, there was nothing, absolutely nothing about temporary structures on private property so long as they didn't cross property lines or violate height restrictions meant for permanent buildings. And that word temporary stuck in my mind like a spark, because temporary is flexible, temporary is vague, temporary is a loophole disguised as a courtesy. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was pacing or furious, but because ideas kept forming, stacking on top of each other like bricks, and every idea made my pulse slow instead of race, and by morning I knew I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to plead, and I wasn't going to involve authorities or lawyers or committees that thrived on delay and compromise, because compromise is just surrender, dressed up as civility. And what I wanted wasn't an apology or a trimmed hedge restored. What I wanted was for him to understand, deeply and personally, what it feels like to have someone decide your view matters less than theirs. For the rest of that day, I acted normal, waved at neighbors, went to work, answered emails. But inside, I was counting measurements, visualizing angles, replaying that moment over and over, his words looping in my head, for a better view, until they stopped sounding smug and started sounding like a challenge. And one afternoon, while driving past the industrial area on the edge of town, I saw them, stacked too high behind a warehouse, massive steel shipping containers, rusted and scarred and ugly in the most honest way possible, the kind of ugly that doesn't pretend to be anything else. And I pulled over without even thinking, my heart thudding, not with anger now, but anticipation, because in that instant I could see it, perfectly, vividly, the shape of my response rising taller than any hedge ever could, blocking not just a view, but a sense of entitlement. And as I sat there in my car staring at those containers baking in the sun, I smiled, for the first time since the hedges were cut. Not a happy smile, not a cruel one, but a patient one, the kind that waits. Because revenge, when done right, doesn't rush. It lets the other person enjoy their victory just long enough to believe it's permanent.
I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not friends, not neighbors, not even the guy at work who loved gossip more than his actual job, because plans like this rot if exposed to daylight too early. And instead, I started making quiet calls during lunch breaks, asking simple questions in an unremarkable tone. How much to rent? How long delivery takes? What qualifies as temporary? And every answer tightened the shape of the thing forming in my head. Because the containers weren't rare or forbidden or even that expensive if you didn't care how pretty they were. And I very specifically did not care. I wanted rust, dents, faded logos, steel that looked like it had lived a hard life and didn't apologize for it. And when the rental manager asked what I planned to use them for, I said storage, because that was technically true. I planned to store a message inside them. And when he asked how many, I paused just long enough to feel the weight of the number before saying it, and even through the phone I could tell it surprised him. But money smoothed surprise into acceptance very quickly. The days between placing the order and delivery crawled. Every morning I looked out at my mutilated hedges and felt that same quiet pressure building behind my ribs. And every evening I noticed how often the HOA president seemed to be outside now, how often he stood on his deck pretending to check his phone while really just enjoying the openness he'd carved out for himself. And I let him enjoy it. I let him think he'd won something permanent, because nothing makes the fall feel sharper than confidence. The night before delivery, I barely slept. Not from nerves, but from excitement that felt almost dangerous in its clarity, like I was finally aligning with myself after days of swallowing frustration. And just before dawn, I stood in my backyard with a tape measure and marked the ground, careful, precise, staying well within my property line, respecting every rule he thought gave him power over me. And the sky was barely light when I heard the engines, deep and heavy, not the whining scream of hedge trimmers, but the slow, confident rumble of something that doesn't need permission to exist. The first truck rolled in just as the neighborhood began to wake up, and I could feel eyes on me from behind curtains, that subtle shift when routine breaks and people sense entertainment. And the driver hopped down, clipboard in hand, looking at the marks I'd placed, nodding as if this was just another Tuesday. And when the container was lifted off the truck and lowered onto my yard, the ground vibrated under my feet, a physical punctuation mark.
and I felt a strange, almost giddy calm wash over me as rusty steel settled exactly where my hedges used to stand tall and green. By the time the second truck arrived, the HOA president was outside, and I watched from my porch as confusion flickered across his face, that brief, delicious moment when a man realizes the rules he used like a weapon are about to be turned into a shield for someone else. And he walked down the slope toward my yard, his pace quickening with each step, calling my name with a forced laugh that tried and failed to sound friendly. And I waited until the second container was halfway down before answering, because timing matters. And when I finally turned to face him, I kept my expression neutral, polite even, the same way he'd spoken to me while my hedges were being destroyed. He asked what I thought I was doing, and I told him I was improving my view. And the way his jaw tightened told me the words landed exactly where I wanted them to. And he started talking about aesthetics and neighborhood standards and how this would never be allowed, and I listened patiently, genuinely patiently, because I knew something he didn't. And when he finished his speech, I simply said, temporary storage, private property, compliant with height limits, and watched his certainty drain away piece by piece. He threatened fines, and I nodded. He threatened meetings, and I smiled, because every threat was built on assumptions that no longer applied. And when the third container arrived and was stacked carefully on top of the first, towering over what used to be my yard, blocking not just his view of me, but my view of him entirely, the look on his face shifted from anger to something closer to fear, because it wasn't about what he could see anymore. It was about what he couldn't. Neighbors gathered openly now, phones out, whispering, and I could feel the narrative slipping out of his control, because this wasn't a quiet trimming done under the guise of maintenance. This was loud, heavy, undeniable. And he pulled me aside, lowering his voice, asking if we could work something out, and I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. But instead, I told him calmly that if my hedges ever grew back to their original height without interference, the containers might leave sooner than expected. And the way he stared at me then told me he finally understood this wasn't a tantrum, it was a mirror. That evening, when the trucks were gone and the containers stood like a rusted wall along my property line, I sat in my backyard for the first time since the hedges were cut and felt something close to peace. Because the road noise was gone again, the sense of being watched evaporated, and somewhere beyond that steel barrier I knew a man was standing on his deck staring at nothing, realizing that his better view had cost him far more than he'd imagined. And as the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long across the containers, I felt no guilt, only a steady satisfaction, because I hadn't broken the rules. I hadn't yelled or begged or involved anyone else to fight my battle. I had simply responded in kind, with something bigger, heavier, and impossible to ignore. And I knew deep down this still wasn't over, because men like him don't let go of control easily. And the real suspense wasn't whether the containers would stay, but how far he'd go before realizing that every move he made from now on would only tighten the steel wall he'd forced me to build.
The next morning felt different in a way I couldn't quite explain at first, like the air itself had weight to it. And when I stepped outside with my coffee and saw the containers standing there in the early light, streaked with rust and casting long shadows across my yard, I felt grounded, protected, but also aware that this kind of move doesn't land quietly in a place built on appearances and whispered power. And sure enough, I noticed small things almost immediately. The way conversations stopped when I walked past. The way people who used to wave now pretended to be deeply interested in their mailboxes. And none of it surprised me because control doesn't like being challenged in public. It prefers silence and isolation. And by mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from the HOA group chat, not addressed to me directly, but carefully phrased, talking about unauthorized visual obstructions and community concerns. And I read it slowly, smiling to myself, because every word was vague enough to be useless, and every sentence betrayed frustration. I didn't respond, not because I was afraid, but because silence can be louder than argument. And instead, I went about my day, knowing full well that the containers were now the center of the neighborhood's attention, a physical manifestation of resistance that people couldn't unsee. And when I came home that evening, I noticed the HOA president standing near the property line again, this time with 2 board members beside him, all 3 staring up at the steel wall like it might blink first. And I stayed inside long enough to let them wonder whether I'd even come home, because uncertainty gnaws at people who were used to being obeyed.
When I finally stepped outside, called and unhurried, they turned toward me in unison, and the president launched into a rehearsed speech about harmony and visual standards and how this wasn't the right way to handle disagreements. And I listened without interrupting, letting his words spill out and evaporate against the containers behind me. And when he finished, I asked him, very quietly, why cutting my hedges without notice had been the right way. And the pause that followed was long and uncomfortable, because there was no answer that didn't expose what he'd done, and one of the board members shifted awkwardly while the other stared at the ground, and that was when I realized the power dynamic had already changed, because this wasn't a united front anymore. It was a man trying to regain control of a story that had slipped from his hands. Over the next week, the pressure became subtler but more constant. Anonymous notes about property values slipped into mailboxes, neighbors stopping just short of accusing me directly but making sure I heard phrases like eyesore and embarrassing. And at night, I sometimes caught movement near the containers, flashlights sweeping briefly before disappearing. And instead of fear, I felt a slow, steady resolve hardened inside me, because intimidation only works when you still believe the other side has authority over your peace, and I no longer did. I added small touches to the containers, not graffiti or anything dramatic, just practical things. Planters at the base, climbing vines starting to take hold, lights along the top that came on automatically at dusk, turning the wall into something intentional, something that said this wasn't a tantrum, it was a choice. And the more intentional it looked, the angrier the president seemed to get, because you can argue against chaos, but you can't easily argue against calm purpose. One afternoon, I heard raised voices outside and stepped out to find him arguing with a neighbor who had apparently complained about the containers blocking sunlight, and the irony almost made me laugh, but I kept my face neutral as I listened to him insist that something had to be done, that rules existed for a reason. And when the neighbor walked away unconvinced, I saw something flicker in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, not anger, but desperation, and that was the moment I knew he'd underestimated me completely. That night, I sat in my backyard, leaning against cool steel, listening to the muffled sounds of the road beyond, and thought about how quickly people reveal themselves when their leverage disappears, how a man who'd smiled while taking my privacy now couldn't tolerate losing his own sense of dominance, and I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, not for him, but for the way systems encourage people like him to confuse authority with entitlement. And as the wind moved through the yard and the containers creaked softly, I understood that the real revenge wasn't the blocked view or the rusted steel. It was forcing him to live every day with the uncertainty he'd so casually imposed on me, to wake up and look at a reminder that his decisions had consequences he couldn't trim away. And as I went inside and turned out the lights, I knew the story still had distance left to run, because a man backed into a corner doesn't stop pushing, and I was ready to let him exhaust himself against a wall that wasn't going anywhere.
The last move didn't come from him, not directly, and that was how I knew he was running out of ideas, because when people lose control, they start outsourcing pressure. And it began with small inconveniences that were meant to feel coincidental. A delivery truck blocking my driveway for just a little too long, trash bins mysteriously knocked over, a late-night knock that stopped the moment I turned on the lights. And I absorbed all of it without reaction, because reacting was what he wanted, proof that he could still reach me. And instead, I kept building the quiet narrative of permanence. I added more greenery, more structure, turning the containers into something that looked less like protest and more like intention. And the more intentional it became, the more absurd his original justification sounded, because no one could honestly claim this was temporary chaos anymore. It was a living boundary, and boundaries terrify people who thrive on access. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and turned the rusted steel a deep glowing orange, he showed up alone. No board members, no rehearsed speech, just him standing there with his hands shoved into his pockets like a man trying to remember how he used to talk to people before power did the talking for him. And he asked if we could just reset, use that exact word, reset, like what he'd done could be wiped away with the right tone. And I let the silence stretch between us, because silence forces honesty out into the open.
And finally, I asked him if he'd reset my hedges, if he'd put back the years of growth and the sense of safety I'd lost in one morning. And his eyes flicked away for just a second, long enough to answer without words. He said the neighborhood was divided now, that people were upset, that property values were being discussed. And I told him calmly that when my hedges were cut, the neighborhood hadn't been consulted either. That division had existed long before the containers arrived. It just hadn't been visible to the people who benefited from it. And something in his posture sagged then, like he'd been holding himself up with borrowed confidence, and it was finally running out. The next week, a vote was announced, not official enough to carry weight, but loud enough to signal desperation. And I attended, not to plead my case, but to watch, to see how stories shift when they're forced into the open. And as neighbors spoke, some angry, some conflicted, some quietly supportive, I noticed how often they circled back to that first act, the cutting of the hedges, how often someone would say, almost reluctantly, that maybe it hadn't been handled well. And the president sat there stiffly, realizing that what he'd framed as maintenance had become the origin point of every complaint in the room. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice or accuse anyone. I simply described how it felt to wake up and lose privacy without consent, how quickly safety can evaporate when someone else decides your comfort is negotiable. And I watched faces soften, not because they loved the containers, but because they understood the line that had been crossed. And understanding is contagious in a way authority never is. After that, things slowed. The notes stopped, the late-night disturbances faded, and the containers just existed, part of the landscape now. And I think that was the hardest part for him. Not that he'd lost the view, but that he'd lost the narrative. Because every time someone asked why they were there, the answer traced back to his decision, not mine. And you can't trim away a story once it's taken root. Months passed. Seasons shifted, vines crept higher along the steel, and one afternoon I saw him for the last time in any meaningful way, standing on his deck, staring at the wall with an expression that wasn't anger anymore, but resignation, the look of someone who finally understands that control only works when it's invisible, and once it's exposed, it collapses under its own weight. I never removed the containers, not because I needed them anymore, but because they reminded me of something important, that peace isn't given, it's defended, sometimes quietly, sometimes with rusted steel and patience. And as I sat in my yard that evening, listening to the wind move through leaves that were slowly growing back on my terms, I felt whole again, not triumphant in a loud way, but settled. Because the best revenge isn't humiliation or victory speeches. It's living well behind boundaries no one else gets to decide for you, and knowing that the person who tried to take that from you has to wake up every day and look at the consequence of believing your view mattered less than theirs.